The bound realm had no written laws. There were no scrolls in the archives detailing what was forbidden, no stone tablets carved with commandments, no books of codes that judges consulted when rendering verdicts. The laws of the bound realm existed in a different way, in a place deeper than parchment or stone. They existed in the bones of the kingdom itself, woven into the very fabric of the land, and every person born within its borders felt them the moment they drew their first breath. A pressure, subtle but constant, that told them where they could go and where they could not. The king felt every violation, every transgression, every moment when someone pushed against the boundaries that held the kingdom together. He felt it as pain, as pressure, as a wrongness that made his bones ache and his blood burn. Broke through the boundary that should not be broken, the king felt it like a knife to the heart, and the transgressor felt it too. Crime was nearly non-existent because crime was impossible. You could not steal without the binding crushing your hand. You could not murder without the binding stopping your heart. He had felt minor violations, small pains that came and went like pinpricks, barely worth noting. But he had never felt what happened the night she crossed the unspoken law. It began as a tremor. When the sensation hit him, and he dropped the paper he was holding, his hand flying to his chest. The binding was screaming. Not with pain exactly, though there was pain. He closed his eyes and let the binding guide him, let it show him what it had felt, and he saw her. The boundary was not a physical wall, though it had been marked with stones and warnings over the centuries, because the binding would tear you apart rather than let you leave. But she had crossed it. The silent king felt her step over the line, felt the binding reach for her, felt it try to stop her, to pull her back, to punish her for the transgression. But something was wrong. The binding could not hold her. It slid off her like water off stone, unable to find purchase, unable to enforce the law. And the silent king felt that scream echo through his entire body. He collapsed to his knees, gasping, his hands pressed to the floor, and he felt the wrongness of it settle into his bones. Someone had crossed the boundary. He called for the captain of the guard. Torrin arrived within minutes, his face tight with concern, and he found the king still on the floor, pale and shaking. "My lord, what happened?" "Someone crossed the boundary," the silent king said, his voice hoarse. "Send riders. Find them. Bring them to me." Torrin's face went white. "The binding? I know what the binding should have done. It did not work. Find them." Torrin bowed and left, and the silent king remained on the floor of his study, feeling the echo of the violation still reverberating through the binding, through him. Her pack opened beside her, as though she were simply a traveler resting for the night. She did not try to flee when the riders approached. She simply looked up at them with calm, dark eyes and said, "I have been waiting for you." They brought her back across the boundary, and the silent king felt her return the same way he had felt her leave. The binding tried to reconnect to her, tried to reestablish the bond that should have been there, but it could not. She existed outside it somehow, untouched by the magic that governed everyone else. She was brought to the throne room in chains, though the chains were precautionary rather than necessary, and her dark hair was pulled back in a braid that hung down her back. She did not look dangerous. She did not look like someone who had done the impossible. But she had. When she reached the base of the throne, the guards forced her to kneel, but her eyes remained level with his, unafraid, and steady. Yes. He leaned forward, his hands gripping the arms of the throne. The binding should have killed you. It should have torn you apart the moment you stepped over the line. Why did it not? She tilted her head slightly, as though considering the question. Because I am not bound. The words fell into the throne room like stones into still water, and the silence that followed was absolute. The guards shifted uneasily. The few council members who had been present exchanged glances. The silent king stared at her, his mind racing. Everyone born in this realm is connected to the binding from their first breath. There are no exceptions. I am the exception, she said calmly. That is impossible, and yet I stand before you. He felt anger flare in his chest, hot and sharp. You will explain how this is possible. Now. She met his gaze without flinching. I was born beyond the boundary. In the unbound lands, my mother crossed when she was pregnant with me, and I was born on the other side. The binding never touched me. I have lived my entire life outside it. Then why are you here? Why did you come back? Because I wanted to see what I was missing. The silent king felt the binding surge with anger, with offense, and he had to force himself to remain calm. You call this realm a prison? What else would you call it? Your people have no freedom. They cannot choose their own paths because the binding chooses for them. They cannot make mistakes, cannot learn from failure, cannot grow. They are safe, yes, but they are not alive. They are alive and content. There is no crime, no suffering, no chaos. There is no choice. And without choice, what is the point of living? He stood, his hands clenched into fists, and he descended the steps of the throne until he stood before her. Up close, he could see the details of her face, the small scar on her cheekbone, the laugh lines at the corners of her eyes. She looked like someone who had never bowed to anyone, who had never felt the weight of the binding pressing down on her, telling her what she could and could not do. Then kill me, she said calmly, but I suspect you will not. Why would I not? Because I am the first person you have ever met who is truly free, and you want to know what that feels like. He felt curious. Take her to the Black Tower, he said to the guards. Lock her in the highest chamber. Post guards at every entrance. She is not to leave, and she is not to be harmed. Feeling the binding pulse with confusion and anger, and something that might have been fear. When the throne room emptied, he remained standing at the base of the throne, staring at the place where she had knelt, and he felt the question she had planted in his mind take root. What did freedom feel like? The Black Tower was the oldest structure in the palace, a relic from the time before the binding. It had not been used in centuries, not since the binding had made it unnecessary, and the chamber at the top had become little more than a storage room for forgotten things. The guards cleared it out, brought in a bed and a table and a chair, and they locked Erise inside. She did not protest. She walked to the window and looked out over the kingdom, her expression thoughtful, and when the door closed and the lock turned, she simply sat on the bed and waited. The silent king did not visit her that first day. He told himself it was because he was too busy, that the kingdom required his attention, that there were reports to read and decisions to make. But the truth was that he was afraid of the way the binding recoiled from her presence, and left him feeling exposed and uncertain. But on the second day he went. He climbed the stairs of the Black Tower alone, ignoring the protests of his guards, and when he reached the top, he unlocked the door himself. Arise was sitting by the window, her hands folded in her lap, and she turned when he entered. "I wondered when you would come," she said. He closed the door behind him. "I am not imprisoned, I am a guest. You are a criminal. By your laws, perhaps, but I do not recognize your laws. There is no poverty, no violence, no suffering. The binding ensures that everyone has what they need, that no one can harm another, that the kingdom functions as it should. How is that a prison?" "Because none of it is chosen," she said, rising to stand beside him. "Your people do not help each other because they want to. They help because the binding compels them. They do not refrain from violence because they believe it is wrong. They refrain because the binding punishes them if they try. Every action, every thought, every choice is filtered through the binding, and that is not freedom. That is control. Control is not inherently evil. Control brings order, safety, peace. Control also brings stagnation. You have built a perfect cage, and your people have forgotten they are in it." He turned to her, anger flaring again. "You speak as though freedom is the only thing that matters. But freedom brings chaos. I have read the histories. The binding ended suffering by ending choice, and in doing so it ended what it means to be human." "And what does it mean to be human?" She looked at him, and in her eyes he saw something that made his chest tighten. Compassion. "It means the ability to make mistakes, to choose wrong and learn from it, to grow and change and become something more than what you were. Your people cannot do that. They live, yes, but they do not grow." He turned away from her, his hands clenched on the windowsill. "You do not understand. The binding is not just control, it is connection. Every person in this realm is connected to me, to each other, to the land itself. I feel them. I feel their pain when they are hurt, their fear when they are afraid. I feel the kingdom as a living thing, and I govern it as such. That is not control, that is care." "And what about your pain?" she asked softly. "What about your fear? Who feels that?" He went still. "I am the king. My feelings are irrelevant. Are they? Or have you simply been taught to ignore them because the binding does not allow you to have them?" He turned to face her, his eyes hard. "I am not bound the way my people are. The binding flows through me, yes, but I am not controlled by it. I make my own choices." "Do you?" The question hung in the air between them, and the silent king felt something crack inside him. A small fissure, barely noticeable, but there, because she was right. He had never questioned the binding, had never wondered if his thoughts were his own, or if they were shaped by the magic that flowed through him. He had simply assumed that he was free, that the king was exempt from the control that governed everyone else. But what if he was not? He sat on the throne and felt the binding hum through him, connecting him to the kingdom, and for the first time he noticed things he had never noticed before. The way it whispered in the back of his mind, a constant presence that he had always thought was his own voice, but might not be. He began to wonder if he had ever made a choice that was truly his own. The realization terrified him. But the moment the thought formed, he felt the binding press against it, creating a subtle discomfort, a sense that he pushed through the discomfort and canceled the meeting anyway. A small sense of victory. He had made a choice the binding had not wanted him to make, and he had survived. It was a tiny rebellion, meaningless in the grand scheme of the kingdom, but it mattered to him, because it proved that he could resist. He wore different clothes than the binding suggested. On the fourth day, he returned to the Black Tower, and this time he brought questions that cut deeper than any he had asked before. "If the binding is controlling me," he said, standing in the doorway, "then who am I? If every thought I have is shaped by it, if every decision is influenced, what part of me is actually me?" "You are the part that questions," she said quietly. "You are the part that is here, asking me this question even though the binding does not want you to, because I can see it in you, the way your jaw is tight, the way your hands are clenched, the way you keep shifting your weight as though you are fighting the urge to leave. The binding is trying to pull you away from me, trying to tell you that I am dangerous, that you should not trust me. But you are here anyway. That is you. That is the part of you that is real. The binding did not want him here. It wanted him away from Maryse, away from the questions she raised, away from the possibility that he might change. Separating yourself from it will feel, I need to know who I am. Then larger ones, until you can feel the difference between your will and its influence. I have already started. I canceled a council meeting, wore different clothes, stayed up late. Each time there was pain. Good, that pain is the binding fighting you, and each time you push through it, you are proving that you are stronger than it is. What if I am not? What if the binding is right, and I need its guidance to function? Then you will make mistakes, but you will learn from them, and you will grow. That is what it means to be human. The binding has been trying to make you perfect, but perfection is stagnation. Growth requires failure. He looked at her, this woman who had appeared out of nowhere and turned his world upside down, and he felt something inside him shift, not break exactly, but open. They spent the next weeks working together. Aries taught him techniques for recognizing when the binding was influencing him, for creating space between his thoughts and its whispers. And he practiced. Every day he made choices that went against the binding's guidance. Some were trivial. He took a different route through the palace than the one the binding preferred. He spoke to servants the binding had always kept him distant from. He read books the binding had subtly steered him away from, books about philosophy and freedom and the nature of consciousness. Other choices were more significant. He began to question the laws the binding enforced. He asked his advisors to explain the reasoning behind certain restrictions, and when they could not, when they simply said, "Because the binding says so," he started to dismantle those restrictions. He allowed people to travel more freely. Each change brought pain. The binding fought him every step of the way, flooding him with anxiety and doubt, making his body ache, his mind fog, his will falter. He began to recognize which thoughts were his and which were not. You have been making decisions that go against established practice. You have been questioning the binding. We fear that you are being influenced by the prisoner. Her name is Aries, the Silent King said calmly. She does not understand how the realm functions. Her presence here is dangerous. She understands more than you think, and I am beginning to understand that our people have not been free for a very long time. It was created by people 800 years ago, and people are not infallible either. The binding has kept us safe, yes, but it has also kept us frozen. I have ruled for 14 years, and in that time the kingdom has not changed at all. What are you saying, my lord? I am saying that I am going to start making changes, small ones at first. We will allow people more freedom to make their own choices, and we will see what happens. My lord, this is madness. Perhaps, but it is my decision to make, and I am making it. He had made his choice, and he would see it through. The first changes were implemented over the following months. The response was mixed. Some people embraced the changes, celebrating the new freedoms, exploring possibilities they had never been allowed to consider. Others were terrified, convinced that the loosening of the binding would lead to disaster. Without the binding to guide them, people made mistakes. Merchants made bad deals that cost them their livelihoods. Travelers got lost or injured in areas they did not know. Artists created works that offended and divided. There were conflicts, arguments, moments of genuine danger. But there were also successes. New trade routes were established that brought prosperity to regions that had been stagnant for centuries. Artists created works of stunning beauty and profound insight that moved people in ways the binding had never allowed. People began to think for themselves, to question, to innovate. The kingdom was changing, and the silent king, watching it happen, felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt alive. His relationship with Aries deepened during this time, talking about the changes in the kingdom, planning for the future, about the hopes and fears they shared with him when he visited the provinces, about the way they were slowly learning to trust their own judgment. They fell in love not in a single moment, but in 1,000 small ones, in the way she laughed when he made a self-deprecating joke, in the way they trusted each other with truths they had never shared with anyone else. One evening, as they walked through the gardens, he stopped and turned to her. "I need to tell you something." "What is it?" "I love you." She looked at him, and he saw surprise in her eyes, quickly followed by something softer. "You love me, but I have been practicing what you taught me. And this feeling, this love, it is mine. It is real. And I needed you to know." She reached up and touched his face, her fingers gentle. "I love you too." "You do? You have never asked me for anything. You have only ever pushed me to be better, to think more clearly, to choose for myself, because that is what love is. They will say I have bewitched you, that I am destroying the kingdom. Let them say it. I do not care. I am choosing this. I am choosing you, and that is all that matters." She smiled, tears shining in her eyes. "Then yes, I will marry you." It was held not in the grand throne room, but in the gardens, under the open sky, with flowers blooming wild around them. The ceremony was simple. The vows they spoke were their own, and when they kissed, the gathered crowd erupted in cheers that could be heard throughout the capital. The council was horrified. 3 members resigned in protest, referring to her only as the king's wife when they were forced to mention her at all. But the silent king did not care. He had Aries, and together they continued to transform the kingdom. Aries proved to be a brilliant advisor. She understood things about governance that the council did not, things that could only be learned by living outside the binding's influence. How to create systems that supported people without dictating their choices. How to allow for failure without allowing for chaos. She helped the king design new institutions, councils where common people could voice their concerns and have them heard, schools where children were taught to think critically rather than simply absorb the binding's guidance, courts where laws were debated and refined rather than simply enforced. The changes were not easy, but Aries was always there, reminding him why they were doing this. "It is worth it," she would say. "Even when it is hard, it is worth it. These people are learning to be human again." And she was right. The binding remained, but it was softer now, more like a safety net than a cage. The silent king and heiress had children, 2 daughters and a son. They raised them to question, to think, to choose. Their eldest daughter, Marin, grew up fierce and independent. Their son, Torian, became a scholar of the binding. Their youngest, Lyra, became a bridge between rulers and ruled. The years passed. The kingdom continued to change, to grow, to become something it had never been before. But it is not good either. It is a tool. And like any tool, it depends on how you use it. Use it to control, and you build a prison. Use it to support, and you build a foundation. The choice is yours. His last thought was of her, and how grateful he was that she had crossed that boundary, that she had shown him what it meant to be free. It shifted, found a new anchor in his son, Torian, who held it as a partnership rather than a dominion. And the kingdom, no longer frozen, continued to grow. The unspoken law had been broken. Aries looked up from the book she had been reading, something the guards had brought her at her request. "I listen to myself. I think about what I want, what I believe, what I value, and I make the best choice I can with the information I have. And if you choose wrong, then I learn from it. I adjust. I try again. That sounds exhausting. It is. But it is also exhilarating. Every choice I make is mine. Every mistake I make is mine to own and learn from. I am not perfect, and I do not pretend to be, but I am free." He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "The binding has been with me my entire life. It is part of me." He looked at her, and he felt something stir in his chest. Not anger, not fear, but something closer to hope. "What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting that you try, not forever. Just for a moment, let go of the binding. See what it feels like to make a choice without it. I cannot let go of the binding. It is woven into me. I am the anchor that holds it to the kingdom. If I let go, the entire realm would collapse. Not entirely, just a small part. Just enough to see what it feels like." He stared at her, his heart pounding. The idea was terrifying. The binding was everything. It was the foundation of his rule, the source of his power, the connection that made him a king rather than just a man. To let go, even for a moment, felt like stepping off a cliff and hoping he would not fall. But he wanted to know. She stood and crossed the room, stopping just in front of him. "Just be." He hesitated, then closed his eyes. He breathed. And in that silence he felt something he had not felt in 14 years. He felt afraid. Not the controlled fear the binding allowed, the fear that was useful and proportional, but raw, unfiltered terror. Fear of making the wrong choice. Fear of being inadequate. Fear of the responsibility that rested on his shoulders. He staggered back, his breath coming in short gasps, and he looked at Eris with something close to panic. "That is what it feels like?" he asked. "That fear, that uncertainty, that is what you live with every day?" "Yes," she said quietly. And it is terrifying, but it is also real, and it is mine." He sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, his hands shaking. "I do not know if I can do that. I do not know if I am strong enough." "You are stronger than you think," he asked, "and I think you deserve better." He felt something shift in his chest, something warm and unfamiliar. "You do not even know me." "I know enough. I know that you feel the pain of your people. I know that you care about them, that you want to do right by them. I know that the binding has taken that care and twisted it into control, made you believe that the only way to protect them is to take away their choices." He looked at her, this woman who had appeared out of nowhere and upended everything he believed, and he felt the binding pull at him, warning him. He visited Aries every day, sometimes for hours, and they talked. Who had chosen exile over a life dictated by the binding. Her mother had been young, barely 17, when the binding had begun pushing her toward a union with a man twice her age, a wealthy merchant who had negotiated the arrangement with her family. But her mother had felt something the binding could not account for, a desperate, clawing need to choose her own life. "She walked for 3 days," Aries said, her voice soft with memory. "The closer she got to the boundary, the more the binding fought her. By the time she reached it, she could barely stand. She told me it felt like drowning and then suddenly breaking the surface and breathing air for the first time." "And your father?" the king asked. She met him in the unbound lands. He was a wanderer, someone who had been born outside the realm and never understood why anyone would choose to live within it. They built a life together, a small one, but it was theirs. My father died when I was 12. My mother followed him 2 years later. That is the cost of freedom. But Aries spoke of it as a cage, and the more time he spent with her, the more he understood what she meant. He told her about his own life, about being raised in the palace, trained from birth to be the anchor for the binding. "They taught me to feel the binding, to let it flow through me," she asked. "When the binding first settled on you." He was quiet for a long moment, remembering. It was like being swallowed. "One moment I was standing in the coronation chamber, alone, scared, grieving my father. The next moment I was everyone. I thought I would go mad from it. But my tutors had trained me well. I learned to filter it, to let most of it wash over me, and only pay attention to the important things, the major violations. It was the foundation of the kingdom, the source of peace and order. To question it would have been to question existence itself. But you are questioning it now." "Yes, because of you." She reached out and took his hand, and he felt the warmth of her touch, uncomplicated by the binding, free of the magic that colored every other interaction he had ever had. About whether it was better to be safe or free, whether control could ever be justified, whether the ends justified the means. Even his advisers shaped their words carefully, offering guidance but never contradicting him outright. But Aries did not care about any of that. She pushed back against his justifications. She made him defend positions he had never had to defend before, and in doing so, she made him think. One evening, as they sat by the window watching the sun set over the kingdom, she asked him a question that changed everything. "Have you ever considered that the binding might be controlling you?" He looked at her, startled. "What do you mean?" "You are the anchor. The binding flows through you. But what if it is not just flowing? What if it is shaping you, guiding your thoughts, making you believe that its will is your will. That is absurd. I am the king. The binding serves me, not the other way around. Does it? He felt anger flare, hot and defensive, and he stood abruptly, pacing away from her. You go too far. Do I? Have you ever made a decision that went against what the binding wanted? Have you ever felt it push back, pressure you, make you uncomfortable until you changed your mind? He opened his mouth to deny it, but the words died on his tongue. There had been moments, small ones, when he had considered a course of action and felt the binding resist, felt it whisper that this was not the right path, that he should choose differently. And he had always listened, had always adjusted, had always assumed that the binding knew better. But what if it did not? What if the binding was not guiding him, but controlling him? The thought was terrifying. It meant that he was not the master of the binding, but its puppet. I need to think, he said, his voice strained. Then think. But do not run from the question just because it frightens you. He left the Black Tower and did not return for 5 days. Those 5 days were agony. The silent king sat on his throne and felt the binding hum through him, and he tried to separate his own thoughts from its influence. It was nearly impossible. The binding was so deeply woven into him that he could not tell where it ended, and he began. Every thought seemed to carry its whisper. Every decision seemed shaped by its pressure. He tried the exercise Aries had taught him, tried to create a pocket of silence where the binding did not reach. But it was harder now, more painful, as though the binding sensed what he was trying to do and was fighting back, that he was just a shell the magic had filled and shaped and used. He broke down in his private chambers, alone in the dark, and wept for the first time since he was a child. When he returned to the Black Tower, Aries took one look at his face and opened her arms. He walked into her embrace and let her hold him, and he told her everything. The fear, the doubt, the terrible realization that he might not be in control of his own mind. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "You learn to trust yourself," she said softly. "You learn to recognize the difference between your thoughts and the binding's influence. And you start making small choices that the binding might not want, and you see what happens. What if I make the wrong choice? Then you learn from it. That is what freedom means. The right to make mistakes and grow from them. I do not know if I can. You can. I believe in you." He pulled back and looked at her, and he saw in her eyes something that made his chest ache. Not pity, not judgment, but faith. She believed he could do this. She believed he could be more than what the binding had made him, and for the first time in his life, he wanted to try. The first small rebellion came a week later. The council brought him a proposal to increase restrictions on trade with the outer provinces, arguing that tighter control would increase stability and reduce the risk of smuggling. The binding hummed its approval, whispering that this was the right path, that control was safety, that the proposal should be accepted. But the silent king thought about what Aries had said, about how control stifled growth, and he made a decision that felt like tearing something inside himself. "No," he said. The council members stared at him in shock. "My lord?" "No, we will not increase restrictions. We will loosen them. We will allow the outer provinces more autonomy in their trade decisions and see what happens." The binding surged. pressing against his mind, flooding him with anxiety and doubt. He felt it trying to change his mind, to make him reconsider, to force him back to the safe, controlled path, but he held firm. The binding punished him for going against its will, sending sharp aches through his skull, his chest, his bones. But he endured it, and eventually it faded. And when it did, he felt something new. He felt proud. He had made a choice that was his own, not the bindings, and he had survived. He told Arise about it that night, and she smiled, genuine and bright. That is the first step. It will get easier. Will it? No, but you will get stronger. The small rebellions continued. He loosened restrictions on travel. He allowed people to choose their own professions rather than being guided by the binding into roles it deemed appropriate. He permitted artists to create works that questioned authority, that explored uncomfortable truths, that challenged the status quo. Each decision brought pain. Each time the binding fought him, tried to force him back to the path it wanted. But each time he resisted, and each time he grew stronger. The kingdom began to change. Slowly at first, almost imperceptibly. But the changes accumulated. People began to think for themselves, to question the old ways, to explore new possibilities. There were mistakes, yes. There were moments of chaos, of conflict, of fear. But there were also moments of growth, of creativity, of innovation. The council was horrified. They came to him repeatedly, demanding that he reverse course, that he restore the binding to its full strength, that he stop this dangerous experiment before it destroyed everything. But the silent king refused, because he had seen something in Ares's eyes, and he had seen it beginning to appear in the eyes of his people. The love between the silent king and Ares deepened as the months passed. They spent every evening together, walking in the palace gardens, talking about the changes in the kingdom, planning for the future. He told her things he had never told anyone, fears and doubts and dreams that the binding would have smoothed away if he had let it. One night, under the stars, he asked her to marry him. She looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. You know this will cause problems. I do not care. The council will say I have bewitched you, that I am using you to destroy the kingdom. Let them say it. They will try to kill me. I will protect you. She smiled, sad and soft. You cannot protect me from everything, and I do not want you to. I am not fragile. I know you are not, but I love you, and I want to spend my life with you. If you will have me. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers gentle. I will, but not because you are a king, or because I want power, or because the binding has made you think you love me. I will marry you because I love you too. The real you, the person you are when you push the binding aside and let yourself be honest. They were married in a quiet ceremony, just the two of them and a single priest who had been chosen for his discretion. The council was furious when they found out, and there were threats of rebellion, whispers of treason, calls for Ares to be exiled or worse. But the silent king stood firm. He told the council that Ares was now the queen, that she would have a voice in governance. The rest grudgingly stayed, and the kingdom continued to change. Ares brought a perspective that the kingdom had never had. She understood what it was like to live without the binding, to make choices and face consequences, to be truly responsible for your own life. It was messy. It was imperfect. Not disappearing entirely, but becoming more of a safety net than a cage, catching people when they fell, but not preventing them from walking. The silent king and heiress had children, 2 daughters and a son. They raised them in a kingdom that was changing, that was learning what it meant to be free. They taught them to think for themselves, to question authority, to make their own choices. Their eldest daughter, Marin, grew up questioning everything. She challenged her parents constantly, argued with the council, pushed against every boundary. And the king, watching her, realized that this was what he had wanted all along. Not obedience, but engagement. Not submission, but growth. Their son, Torian, was quieter, more thoughtful. He spent hours in the library, reading the old histories, trying to understand how the binding had been created, whether it could be truly dismantled or only softened. He became a scholar, an advisor, someone who helped his father think through the complexities of governing a kingdom in transition. Their youngest daughter, Lyra, had her mother's fierce independence. She trained as a healer, going into the villages and helping people without the binding, to protect them from disease or injury. She learned what it meant to face real consequences, real suffering. It was negotiable, adaptable, a tool rather than a master. And the people, given the chance to be free, chose more often than not to be responsible with that freedom. There were still crimes. There was still suffering. But there was also joy, creativity, growth. The Silent King ruled for 38 years, and in that time he transformed from a man who believed in control to a man who believed in trust. He learned to let go of the need to manage every aspect of the kingdom, to accept that people would make mistakes, to understand that growth required risk, and he learned that love was not control. That caring for someone did not mean taking away their choices, that the greatest gift he could give his people was not safety, but freedom. When he grew old, when his body began to fail, he gathered his children and told them what he had learned. "The binding is not evil," he said, "but it is not good either. It is a tool, and like any tool, it depends on how you use it. Use it to control, and you build a prison. Use it to support, and you build a foundation. The choice is yours." He died in his sleep, Erise beside him, her hand in his, and his last thought was not of the kingdom, or the binding, or the weight of the crown. His last thought was of her, and how grateful he was that she had crossed that boundary, that she had broken that unspoken law, that she had shown him what it meant to be free. The binding did not collapse when he died. It shifted, adapted, found a new anchor in his son Torian, who had been trained to hold it differently, to see it as a partnership rather than a dominion. And the kingdom, no longer frozen, continued to grow. Erise lived for 7 more years after her husband's death, and she spent those years traveling the kingdom, talking to people, telling stories about the king who had learned to let go, about the changes that were still unfolding, about the future that was still being written. When she died, she was buried beside him, and the inscription on her tomb read simply, "She crossed the boundary, and in crossing it, she set us all free." And the kingdom, transformed by her courage and his choice, carried that freedom forward into the future, a legacy not of control but of trust, not of certainty but of possibility, not of safety but of life. The unspoken law had been broken, and in breaking it they had discovered something more valuable than any law could ever be. They had discovered what it meant to choose, This has been a story of boundaries crossed and freedom found, of laws unspoken and hearts awakened, of a king who learned that the greatest strength is not control but trust. If this tale moved you, if you felt the weight of the binding or the courage it took to question it, do you believe the binding was necessary, or was it a prison disguised as protection? What does it mean to be truly free, and what are you willing to risk for that freedom? Your reflections give these stories meaning, and I would be honored to hear them. If you enjoyed this journey into the world of the silent bond, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel, so you may return when the next story is told, when another law is questioned, and when freedom, perhaps, is chosen once more. If this tale moved you, if you felt the weight of the binding or the courage it took to question it, I invite you to share your thoughts below. Do you believe the binding was necessary, or was it a prison disguised as protection? What does it mean to be truly free? If you enjoyed this journey into the world of the silent bond, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel, so you may return when the next story is told, when another law is questioned, and when freedom, perhaps, is chosen once more.